Hello, I'm Vanessa Hope, the director of Invisible Nation, and I'm very excited to be joined tonight by two incredibly bright authors and journalists who happen to be in Invisible Nation. Thankfully, I was very fortunate to meet and interview them in Taiwan, where they're coming to us from. And together, we're going to discuss this idea of promoting facts and truth, which could not possibly be more important in this day and age, this age of information warfare that pretty much threatens to end democracy worldwide, but we'll get into it. So first I have Chris Horton, who is a longtime foreign correspondent who has reported from China and Taiwan over decades for every leading news publication you can think of. Most recently, he's the author of a brand new must-read or listen to book, Ghost Nation, the story of Taiwan and its struggle for survival. Hi, Chris. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Vanessa. Thanks for having us over.
Tell me more quickly while we're on the subject of your book. It comes out in the United States February 10th, but I've already listened to the entire audiobook, which is awesome because the audiobook is available and the book is available some countries already. And you're going on to
It's available worldwide outside of the U.S. It'll be released in the U.S. February 10th, but the audio and like Kindle and ebook versions are already available on Amazon and other platforms.
And Wen Liu is a prolific Taiwanese scholar, writer, and activist who most recently authored the must-read or listen to book, Feeling Asian American, Racial Flexibility Between Assimilation and Oppression. She is the chairperson of Kuma Academy on Civil Defense Education. Wen, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, good to see you, Vanessa.
Yeah, it's great to see you. I feel like you're traveling all the time. I don't know if you've been on book tour or you go lecture places or what are you doing?
Yes, I've been to the US for a couple of times for the book and for other kind of civil defense related stuff.
Wow. You know, Kuma Academy is in Invisible Nation. We filmed there and do you want to say what that is actually? Can you tell us about
Sure.
what that is?
So we are a grassroots funded civil defense education school that we provide workshop to teach regular civilians in Taiwan about what is information warfare, how do we counter China's narratives, and how do we understand, international relations better. And we teach civilians medical first responders and how to react to, different crisis situation, particularly war.
Yeah. I don't want to make people think you're too young, but you have a wonderful comment in Invisible Nation about maybe it was other generations, but I think it's also your generation that President Tsai Ing-wen was the first president you voted for. So all you've known is this incredible first female president. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Lucky you. We are never getting a female president in the United States, I don't think, in the lifetime of men, I don't think.
Never say.
Keep hoping, yeah.
Okay. All right. So we're living through this awful era of information warfare, and it's shaping elections, it's shaping wars and public perception from Taiwan now to Venezuela to the United States. Of course, truth feels increasingly fragile, especially when a president calls his social media truth social, and it's full of lies. So why is Taiwan such a critical case study for understanding how truth is contested globally? And this is a question for both of you. Either one of you can go first. Yeah, Wen?
Sure. I do think Taiwan is a really important case because we have experienced, I think, one of the most heavy information attacks from China. And it's not only information warfare, but it's combined with actual military aggression. So the very recent military drill done by China at the end of 2025, the government found that it comes with almost 20,000 pieces of disinformation about this particular drill. So it is both, a kind of psychological attack, but also a misguidance on what is really China's military capacity and what is Taiwan's military capacity. China has been wanted to, insert this defeatism or fatalist idea among Taiwanese population that, our government is weak, our military is weak, so the only option is only to surrender. I think a pretty, difficult narrative that we try to counter. But I do think for, international world, I think it's important to understand sometimes we want to care about Taiwan, but people tend to think in the binary term. For example, we need to care about Taiwan just because it has chips, right? It's strong. Or we need to care about Taiwan because it's weak, right? It's the victim of China. But I think Taiwan is neither super strong nor super weak, right? It's neither the sort of colonizer or like the colonized. We need to think about Taiwan in a complex way. So, for example, Taiwan is now the seventh biggest exporter to the US. We have a big economy, even though people think of us as a small island. We do have the most advanced chips that's being produced in Taiwan, but we have also experienced severe military aggression. So all of those can exist at the same time. So I think to continue to produce this very complex, humanizing narrative about Taiwan is really important, at this age.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel like through your guidance and Chris's guidance in directing Invisible Nation, I was doing all I could to avoid those binaries and avoid those reductive, simplistic narratives like you should only care about Taiwan because of semiconductor chips, or you should only care because militarily it's weak. That was just like, hello, can we please have global solidarity and care about human beings in other countries? Chris, you have, in addition to this amazing book that I've just finished and love, congratulations. It is really a must read. And both of you have written must read books. You've just published a piece in The Observer, which is also tackling this question of Venezuela, which we just mentioned. But I wonder how you look at this question of Taiwan's information environment.
Well, I think one did a good job of summarizing the domestic, the internal aspect of information warfare, but there's also the external, international, global facing information warfare, and there's some overlap. There is this kind of campaign. I mean, it's one of the biggest propaganda campaigns in human history. It's basically convincing the entire world that a country is not a country. You got to hand it to them. They've done a pretty good job. So much of the world is kind of like, oh yeah, Taiwan, it's part of China, right? And they want to leave, or it's kind of like Hong Kong, right? And it's just not. There's no PLA boots on the ground here. The People's Republic of China has never controlled Taiwan for a second. One thing that often gets overlooked, and I guess I have some experience in this, is how much of the Chinese narrative that has been absorbed and internalized by international media. So when I first came here, I moved here from Hong Kong in 2015. The first article that I wrote for a very large American publication that shall remain nameless, I was told by an editor, hey, our style is a little bit weird when it comes to Taiwan. So we can't say Taiwanese people. I had naively called Taiwanese people in the draft that I had sent. And I was like, okay, well, what do we call Taiwanese people if we can't call them Taiwanese people? And it's the people of Taiwan or the people on Taiwan. And, otherwise we're suggesting that it's a country, right? And
Right.
so I got that publication to change that style. And now basically everyone says Taiwanese people. It's okay. But that was only 10 years ago, and that highlights kind of the lingering Cold War mentality, because that's kind of a hangover from, or like residual from, when we used to call Taiwan Free China.
Right.
From the beginning of war, information warfare has been a vital component, and you look at the Japanese invasion of China. You had the Marco Polo Bridge incident. You look at the American war with Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You have Colin Powell at the UN General Assembly lying in front of everybody about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But, there are these hoops that people have historically felt like need to be jumped through. I think the thing with Venezuela, what's interesting about that is there was really not much of an information warfare campaign going along with it. It's just like, we're just going to do it. But China's not doing that with Taiwan. China has most of its citizenry on board, although there are a lot of Chinese people that I've met that think Taiwan should be an independent country and remain as it is. But in order to, make it easier to attack and invade Taiwan, you have to get the foreign community to think, first of all, there's nothing that can stop China. And second of all, really, why should we? I mean, aren't they Chinese in Taiwan? And, it's, the dehumanizing aspect of China's information warfare for the external world, calling Taiwan, the Taiwan issue or the Taiwan question. That's another big thing. Nobody, China knows that people don't want to see, death, but they do want to see conflicts resolved. And I think, even Elon Musk has waded into it, where it's like, maybe there can be a compromise that neither side will like too much. But this is really one of the biggest information warfare campaigns in all of human history. So it's a very important subject case study.
Yeah. After spending a decade reporting from Taiwan and witnessing repeated cycles of military pressure and disinformation and diplomatic isolation, what distinguishes China's information warfare against Taiwan from more familiar forms of propaganda? I feel you've addressed that. If you want to add to it, let me know. Otherwise, I have a follow-up question on what you just said.
Well, I mean, staying on the international media topic, I think, we really need to think, newsrooms should really have a rethink on their Taiwan style, the way that they talk about Taiwan. When you say mainland China in a Hong Kong context, that's fine because Hong Kong's an island. China is the mainland because they're part of the same country. But you look at Taiwan. Taiwan is not part of the PRC. And when we talk about Taiwan and mainland China, that's feeding into this narrative that Taiwan completes China. There's mainland China, and what's
Yeah.
the rest of China? It's Taiwan. And so we need to think about the words that we use. And when we denigrate and diminish Taiwan's sovereignty and democracy by calling it the island rather than the country. I mean, most American media has no problem calling North Korea or Iran a country, but they're kind of adversarial to our governments. Yet Taiwan is friendly; it's a friend, and we willingly just refuse to call it a country, and that should change.
I felt that was extremely clearly articulated and like a critical, essential point in your book and relating to the title of your book, which is that, of course, we know it's China using information warfare to isolate and marginalize Taiwan and have people not call it a country, dehumanizing them by not
Right.
talking about them as they are. And I wondered, just because our audience may not be too familiar with the history of Taiwan, which is, again, please read Chris's book. It's clearly elucidated, but you mentioned free China. And again, you could draw a line between the way in which the United States has not spoken up enough on behalf of the people of Taiwan, Taiwanese people, and their democracy and sovereignty of their country, and how once upon a time we labeled Taiwan free China because we were supporting Chiang Kai-shek and his military dictatorship there and wanted to use that to fight communist Red China, right? I don't know if you would
Right.
like to say something
Well,
about that.
I think the U.S.-Taiwan relationship is it's a complicated one, and while the U.S. In 1947 basically supported and gave political cover to KMT, a Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's party, which had only been in Taiwan for 2 years after Japan's surrender. We gave them weapons, we gave them political cover as they slaughtered a generation of potential Taiwanese leaders, but we're also the only country right now that's willing to just openly sell weapons to Taiwan so it can defend itself. So it's kind of like, yeah, we're maybe not the best friend, but compared to other countries, there's a lot more that the rest of the world and the rest of democracies in the West, but also in Asia can do to help preserve stability in the Taiwan Strait and defend a fellow democracy at a time when democracies are all kind of under threat.
That's a great segue for a question to Wen about this grassroots civil defense work that you're doing for a whole of society resilience for Taiwan. I wonder how disinformation affects people emotionally, psychologically, not just politically, and whether you're dealing with that at Kuma Academy or in your work.
Yeah, I think to echo on Chris, I do think one of the biggest disinformation warfare that, the whole world of international democracy really buys in is China's peaceful rise. So that is precisely a term that I think CCP has trying to sell to the world that, we've seen really tremendous growth economically, militarily of, China's place in the world. I think in the past 30 years, right? But, its regime keep telling people it's not to change the international order, right? They will remain a partner of a different liberal democracy. They only want to do trade. But what we have seen is that it's not just about, the so-called economic or a peaceful rise, that they have expanded tremendously on its military front. And its, national military budgets have increased rapidly and target toward Taiwan, but also other surrounding countries. So it's really trying to be a hegemony, right, in the Asia Pacific. But, the idea of peaceful rise really, I think, influenced generations of Taiwanese people to think about China as a potential negotiable partner. And because Vanessa asked me about, my generation. So, I grew up in the 1990s. And I think for our generation, we really think about the world as a globalized world, right? That, people live in peace, ideas exchanges, cultures are very multipolar, right? But I think there is a dramatic turn when Xi Jinping came to power post 2012, where he crashed down severely, right, inside China, but also boost a lot of the we call wolf diplomacy outside. Well, China has become much more emboldened, and its human rights abuse also got much worse inside China. And then we have Hong Kong's event in 2019, where a lot of democracy protesters are now jailed or on exile. So we do see this really dramatic shift in not just cross-strait relationship, but how China's reacting to the world with its enlarging military economic power. That has, I think, Taiwanese people are taking really the very initial pressure on, China's rise. And inside Taiwan, the research has shown that consistently we have 60% of Taiwanese people are willing to defend Taiwan if China's attacking Taiwan with military force. That's been pretty consistent. But we also have a consistent percentage of people, around 20%, who is more likely to surrender under military pressure. So you have this 20% block, right? 20 to 30% of people who are sort of undecided, and they're weighing on different factors of whether they want to defend Taiwan. And those factors are whether our international allies are willing to help. So as Chris said, right, U.S. plays a big role. If U.S. is willing to assist, then it's really boosting Taiwanese morale. International allies really matter. But in this undecided, 20 to 30%, we also found that psychological defeatism plays a big role, right? So our organization, my academy, really try to explain the modern type of warfare. It's not only decided on, right, the kind of quantitative number of your military strength. It also depends on what we call whole of society resilience, meaning that how resilient our, critical infrastructure are in terms of energy, in terms of food supplies, in terms of medical supplies, in terms of, really importantly, our cultural identity. And in my own research, I also found that in terms of information warfare, it's not just about what is a true piece of information or what's a false piece of information. It's really about the narrative that these different information builds. If the information keeps building on that, as Chris said, right, Taiwanese people are not a people. Taiwan is not a country, or China is, undefeatable, right? If we keep telling those narratives, then we cannot counter these, I think, decades of disinformation warfare that China is trying to bridge internationally. I think the last thing I want to say is also the Cold War dynamic, because I was in U.S. Academia for 20 years. For my education and for my work, I do think in the progressive circles in the U.S., there is this tendency to side with the Chinese narrative, right? That I think people come out of, this Cold War mentality, think that, oh, Taiwan is just a sub-colony of the U.S. empire, right? So we should not support the country. And the kind of human rights and democracy it proclaims is only a Western myth, right? So they tend to want to delegitimize, right, Taiwanese histories of democratization and its search for identity, but they rather believing China as an alternative, a socialist alternative, right, that can counter U.S. hegemony, right? So I think that type of Cold War mentality, or these I think fantasy toward Maoism, I do think it's very prevalent particularly in the progressive circle.
Absolutely. And you reminded me of another point I was going to make when Chris mentioned free China. I was thinking about the fact that when the US called Taiwan Free China under the Republic of China government of Chiang Kai-shek, it was a military dictatorship. It wasn't free. And it
And it
only
wasn't
became
China.
it wasn't China. And it only became free through the democratization done by Taiwanese people after the US left. It was a messy diplomatic series of moves, but nevertheless, it wasn't thanks to the generosity of the US and our democracy promotion that Taiwan became a democracy. Taiwan became a democracy on its own without us there once we left. I mean, and if there was anything inspiring about US democracy for people in Taiwan, I hope you can remind us what it was, because it's not happening in the US right now. I can tell you, we are all wondering where our democracy went.
Well, Taiwan's democratization, I mean, like the Taiwanese people were the key driver of it, but the KMT, the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party that had ruled here with an iron fist for decades. There were some people inside the KMT who were also sympathetic to democratization. Maybe they wanted something that was a little more like Singapore, where there's elections and it's just like one party winning all the time. But
Right.
there was some of that. Also, the U.S. In the 80s, Congress especially, started leaning on Chiang Kai-shek's son's and successor, Jiang Jingguo's regime. But there,
Yeah.
U.S. Like we've been a good friend, we've been a bad friend. We play this role differently in different situations.
Yeah.
Taiwan wasn't destined to become a democracy. People were fighting for it, but there were lots of lucky breaks. And a big one was Lee Teng-hui, who was the first elected president. He was KMT, but in his heart, he was clearly very much a Taiwanese rather than a Chinese nationalist.
Yeah.
Just so
No,
many
that's
things came
absolutely
together that
No, that's absolutely. And, to your point about the US did a few good things along the way, I think that could be why Jiang Jingguo wanted to announce the lifting of martial law to Katharine Graham of the Washington Post on live television, right? I mean, that was something about appealing to American audiences because there was pressure
I think he
to.
also knew he was dying and didn't want to feel like a jerk on the way out. But maybe that's just me.
And I think, again, to your point, when I think in the US right now, there is so much disillusionment, frankly, that danger of losing any sense of hope or having any feeling of resilience is here. Like, again, I don't think that it could be more critical to learn from Taiwan right now for everyone here in the United States, because we need to do a lot of democracy work here. And yet the progressive left does often think, well, US is the big bad, and it's the number one big bad, worse than China's bad. Often they don't even recognize that China's bad. They just excuse it as a growing power and look at it as an economic force and as if there were no politics there. But it is a danger that people then completely fail to see Taiwan or to hear the people of Taiwan and what their true story is. So this is, again,
It's
you,
inconvenient.
yeah,
Taiwan is inconvenient. It goes against a lot of different things that a lot of preconceived notions that a lot of people have, especially on the left. I mean, Taiwan is actually it is a pretty conservative society overall. But if you look at Asia in general, I mean, it's one of the most progressive countries around. First with
yeah,
same-sex marriage, since 2019.
yep,
First country with a woman leader who wasn't connected by blood or marriage to
yep,
the office.
yep,
So, there's a lot of, it still has the death penalty. It still has very harsh drug laws and some other things
yep,
that it could improve. But in general, it's about as progressive as Asia gets, so it should
yeah,
be kind of like this darling of progressives in other places. But again, it's the information warfare. It's so good, and in this century of humiliation, Taiwan is not a
right,
progressive country. It's a shameful bit of history for the Chinese people that has not been rectified. That's
right.
how people on the left in a lot of countries look at Taiwan, and it's just not really the case.
No.
Mhm.
And now I'm throwing in a question that I'm sure you guys can answer better than I can. and many of our viewers who are probably, if they care at all about Taiwan, may be faced with this question at the dinner table or having a coffee with a friend, like this is now coming up in casual conversation all the time, is that people's read on the Venezuela situation and, closeness between Putin and Xi Jinping. And the question that comes up is China's going to invade Taiwan, right? And it's going to happen soon, right? And there's nothing anyone can do about it, right? And the US may or may not be there. We just don't know. How do you guys answer that when that is thrown at you? And maybe that will help other people figure out how to answer that better.
Go ahead, Juan.
Chris, you wrote.
Okay, well, I'll start. I guess I mean, so again, it's just this the efficacy of Chinese disinformation is just it's really impressive. Like you just it's just taken as like gospel truth that that Xi Jinping could just take Taiwan whenever he wants to, but why is the military why is he still building up the People's Liberation Army Navy? Why are they doing these drills? When's the last successful military action that the People's Liberation Army has been involved in? It was Tiananmen Square. It was the invasion of China's own capital. Prior to that, it was like in the late 70s, they invaded Vietnam and they got their nose bloodied and ran back home. I mean, this is a they're thumping their chests. They're banging their drums and they're telling everyone that they're ready to take Taiwan. But this is bigger than, the Normandy landings in World War II. If they were to do it, there's no way you can just drop, a million pairs of boots on the ground. Taiwan is large. It's not a tiny island. It's actually pretty big. Like to take 23 0.5 million people who, presumably are going to be quite pissed off that you're trying to take their sovereignty. You're going to need a lot of people and in order to do that, you're going to have to amass the world's, human history's largest amphibious invasion. And, the notion that China could just flip a switch and just do it is I think it's it's kind of fantasy. But again, I think for a lot of people it's easier to just think like there's nothing we can do,
Right.
And
Right.
defeatism is exactly what Chinese propaganda is aimed at fostering.
Right. Right. Which is why we're having this conversation, because the more people know the truth, the more they can spread it and help to counter that disinformation in an everyday conversation like that, which unfortunately is becoming a topic of everyday conversation. Do you want to add anything to that, Wen? Did you have more to add?
No, I think it's perfectly right. I mean, it's impossible to do a kind of kidnapping. Our president just now, our military capacity is quite strong. And that we are a democracy. So if you take the president out, we have the vice president, we have
Right.
the, executive UN leaders. So it is not a way to defeat Taiwan's democracy.
Yeah.
Mm.
Have you guys must have, and maybe this is too far afield an idea, but is something I think about all the time, which is there any kind of deal you can imagine Xi Jinping would take to lay off Taiwan? Is there any, if obviously facts and truth, reality on the ground, the will of the Taiwanese people does not get through to the leader of China, he does not care. He probably knows the truth and doesn't care and won't admit it anyway. But is there any pressure, any deal, any way to get him to realize that he can have all the trade he wants and maybe some glory from doing the right thing or positive outcomes from not killing people, to just let Taiwan be Taiwan, China be China, and no more aiming missiles and threatening Taiwan militarily all the time?
What?
I do think my with Xi Jinping, I do think the pressure is coming from inside. So, I mean, obviously, the international partners can do a lot of things, right, to tell him this is not the best option. Because if he does attack and Taiwan defends itself, I think we're going to declare independence right away. That would be a great scenario for Taiwan, actually, because the 7 decades of disinformation warfare is going to be crushed. Then Taiwan is going to be free. And I think that's too much of a cost for him. So I do think for him to accept that is not the deal, it's really, I think, the pressure of ruling legitimacy, right? Because she is already on his third term, and he's going to run his fourth term, and he need to have some kind of historical legacy or showing that he is the great leader of, the PRC to calm down all the opposition inside. I mean, it's kind of like Putin, right? Putin is not going to stop war in Ukraine, right? It's not because he has certain agenda to fit in, but because he needs to continue to construct the narrative that the West is the enemies of Russian and democracy does not work for Russian. So that's the myth he has to continue to produce in order to remain ruling in Russia.
Yeah, and building on that, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, so much of their legitimacy has been, based upon in recent years, it's been based upon two things. One has been economic growth. This is like post Tiananmen. It's been economic growth and the rejuvenation of the nation. Becoming a stronger, even feared, country in the world. And a big, if you look at the recent reaction to an acknowledgement of a fact and truth is that Takaichi, the prime minister of Japan, when she said a military conflict in Taiwan, if China were to attack Taiwan, that would be a major event that would probably require mobilization of Japan's military. China freaked out, but this is something that everyone's known forever. I mean, Taiwan is super close. It's just as close to Japan as it is to China and also the Philippines. And, there's the reaction by the CCP to Takaichi's remarks, which she wasn't making anything up, and they know this as well. But it touches upon two things. One of them is this whole Taiwan mythology that they've created, for their domestic and international audiences. But also one thing, this last summer, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, the Communist Party rolled out this new kind of line of propaganda where it's it wasn't the KMT and the Americans who defeated Japan. The Communist Party had a decisive role, and they did not. They were they were hiding and biting. Up in the north, it was the ROC military and the U.S. military that were doing most of the work when it came to defeating Japan. So that I think also she's a woman, and I think you look at the freakouts, the big freakouts. It's like post Pelosi and post Takaichi, right?
Yeah.
But there's there's all these dynamics going on, but really what it is when you touch upon, it's like the end of the Wizard of Oz where Toto pulls the curtain back, he's like, don't look behind that curtain. I mean, that's,
Right.
there could be a moment like that in China. I remember one of my last taxi rides that I took in China was in Kunming, and the taxi driver asked where I was from. I said I was American. He's like, well, America's interesting. I'm like, how so? He's like, I just learned it was you guys and the KMT that defeated the Japanese, not the communists. And I was like, I just started to feel a little nervous, even though I was the only other person in the car. But it's one of those things that it's common knowledge outside of China. But
Right.
there are these, and once people know something, they can't unknow it. So I'd be interested to talk to that guy and see what his thoughts on this was pre Xi Jinping, but and that's the thing. Constructing these fake realities, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Even though they can be quite resilient, all it takes is one carefully aimed fact that just is incontrovertible, that wiggles its way into someone's mind, and then it all falls apart. And
Right.
nobody understands this better than the Chinese Communist Party, and that's why they try to crush any sort of slight indicator of Taiwanese sovereignty anywhere in the world, no matter how small.
Right. And actually, both of you are reminding me, and I believe you might have been personally caught up in this moment, Chris. Once upon a time, there was a certain period of time where there were plenty of foreign correspondents in Beijing for all the major newspapers reporting on China. And Xi Jinping, part of his crackdown relatively recently, was kicking all of them out. And most of them are now in Taiwan, which is actually number one in press freedom, maybe around the world.
In Asia, number one in Asia.
In Asia. So basically, I'm thinking of a couple questions there, because one, there's this excellent Oscar shortlisted documentary by a Russian American filmmaker, Julia Loktev, that is about how Putin cracked down on and basically forced to flee all of the journalists reporting on Russia before he went into Ukraine and invaded
Right.
Ukraine. And so there was kind of a clear no more truth and facts, no more good journalism in this country. Get out. I'm going to do what I want. It's violent. I'm going to invade a country. When Xi Jinping kicked all the journalists out of China, that wasn't why, but can you remind me what was going on? And also when you said internal pressure on Xi Jinping is what can make a difference, you weren't just talking about journalists. Were you talking about other party members or people in the government? That's your question after Chris, maybe.
Okay, well, Xi Jinping didn't kick all the journalists out, and they're very careful. So, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, there was always they all had like at least one reporter left in Beijing. That way, and it's very smart of Beijing to do this. You basically say like, we didn't kick everyone out. Look, the New York Times has this person, Wall Street Journal has that person, but it's only one person when they used to have, many more. But yeah, I mean, this was at the beginning of COVID when China was very much on the defensive. And it really started with the Wall Street Journal opinion section ran a column calling China the sick man of the East, which has, it has some historical connotations that are not very, a bit unsavory, I would say. And, I mean, I can understand why China would be upset or why Chinese people would object to that headline. But I also, there is a firewall between the opinion side and reporting at every publication. So, it was really just punishing reporters for something that they had nothing to do with. But yeah, go ahead.
What's that Chinese saying? Cut off the head of the chicken to scare the monkeys, or is that it?
杀鸡儆猴.
Yeah. Kill the
Say it
kill the
louder.
chicken.
The chicken. I got graphic with cut off the head, but I don't know how else you kill a chicken. But anyway, what was your thought?
So I think talking to diasporic Chinese intellectuals, they think learning from Russia's case, foreign sanctions on Chinese communist elites before the war would be much better than if the war happens and then there will be international sanctions on these elites because, they are as a tight circles who can really affect Xi Jinping's decision. And then we should do everything that we can prior to the conflict rise up. If, unfortunately, the war does break out, I think the most important internal pressures will be the Chinese people. And we already know there's spontaneous protests that happen around China in the past, recent years. And the biggest one would be during COVID, right? There is the white paper revolution. There's a lot of people who, refuse the heavy lockdown of Xi Jinping during the pandemic. So those things will continue to build up and to become forces to delegitimize Xi Jinping's rule. But I think the international allies should do everything that we can before Xi Jinping makes up that decision to just use military force.
Yeah. I just want to, you're making me think of one more point about the power of facts and truth and information overriding, in a way, whatever country and system you've been born into. That I was speaking with the occasional op-ed writer, stand-up comedian Vicky Wong, who's Taiwanese born and raised, but she's in New York now. And she had a routine with this Chinese born and raised stand-up comedian, Jamie Wong, that they would do together cross-strait comedy. And Jamie was apparently making many jokes about the fact that in Taiwan, or in general as a Chinese-born person, when you leave China, people assume you've been brainwashed and you don't really know what democracy is or you won't understand it. And that is just wrong. And one of the beautiful things about journalism and facts and truth in the world and information is that not at all. And that there is a desire to be able to speak the truth and live freely. And that is regardless of where you've been born and raised. And one of the points you make in your book, Chris, is that you live in China in that environment. Yes, you self-censor and you will be afraid to answer a poll. You won't probably be even allowed to take a poll or given a poll in China to answer whether you think Taiwan should be free or left alone or is part of China or not. But the fact is, all of those people are probably free thinking. They're just living within a system that forces them or makes them
Mhm.
fearful, psychologically afraid, and or they're not given the opportunity to speak the truth. But I think that we have a misunderstanding about that. And frankly, there are levels of self-censorship and authoritarianism in every democracy and, especially in the United States right now. I don't know if you wanna speak to that more, Chris, because 'cause I'm gonna go back to my questions, but this is all good conversation you guys are raising.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of Chinese people, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of different kinds of Chinese people when it comes to Taiwan, and I've met many who are just like, yeah, we should go to war, we should take it, it's ours, it was taken from us by the West and Japan. There's other people who are like, Taiwanese, they're basically Chinese, but I don't think we should go to war, and then there's people who come over here as tourists or whatever, and they cycle around the South on bicycles. They eat tasty street food in Tainan. They get lost, and Taiwanese people give them directions or even like take them to wherever they're going. And they realize that what, it's China's big enough as it is, and Taiwan has a good thing going, and it should be allowed to continue doing that. I have friends. Chinese friends who, in China when we first knew each other, they were like, "It's ours. It should be ours." And then I met them here, when they were traveling, and they were like, this should not be ours. Like, this is it. Taiwan's fine the way it is. And I mean,
Yeah,
I think a lot of Chinese people, if they saw, there are definitely a lot who are, very nationalist, and it's maybe not what they were destined to be. But if you grow up in an information environment, you have to unlearn a lot of things. And like
yeah,
growing up in the United States when I did, as I became an adult, I had to unlearn a lot of things. And even just as a
yeah,
journalist, I had when I came to Taiwan, I didn't realize how much propaganda I had ingested, both from the Communist Party and the KMT and the U.S.
yep,
government, the State Department and whatnot. So,
yeah,
you really have to. I think the point when it comes to facts and information and all that is always keeping an open mind to the idea that maybe you've been, duped or brainwashed on something. Just keeping an open
yep,
mind, I think, is the key. And there can be things where you can have you have disagreements with some people on almost everything, but then like on certain things it's kind of like, well, I see their point, and then that at least creates some kind of a bridge. So like, I'm generally
yeah,
not seeing things from the same perspective as Chinese nationalists, but I recently went to the Yasukuni Shrine and the museum in Tokyo, and I saw the way that, and this is not a government funded shrine or museum. This is private funded. It's not like the official Japanese government position on history, but there's some serious whitewashing there. And I was like, well, Chinese nationalists have a point about this one thing. It's
yeah,
it's shameful to not even talk about the what happened in Nanjing and
right,
and and lots of other things. So, I think right now it's a very emotional time for everybody. I think
yeah,
like being able to put our emotions aside as much as we can and just look at reality and see where we can like kind of connect on something. Where do we
yeah,
agree? I think
yeah,
that's really important in terms of not just convincing others of what you think is true, but also kind of testing your belief in the things that you hold true. And truth is true. Facts are facts, but truth can be a very personal thing. In
Mhm.
Taiwan, there are some people here who very much believe in the Republic of China, and they want nothing to do with the People's Republic of China. But they're not super Taiwanese per se, but they want to defend Taiwan from the PRC. There's a lot more people who are like this.
Mhm.
I'm Taiwanese. This is Taiwan. But
yeah,
I guess it's like, how do you connect with people who are not quite seeing things the same way that you are?
yep.
How can you make that a bond rather than something that divides you?
Yes, that's so important, and I also like your point about unlearning. That was something we all have to do, and humility about where you're coming from and what you've been taught, and openness to understanding, especially other people speaking other languages and other countries, and trying to hear them out and understand. I mean, you've done it beautifully in your book. You do it beautifully when bridging cultures. And the three of us are having way too much fun in this conversation that has already gone on 50 minutes. And so I'm like, Do I go through my prepared questions for you, kind of rapid fire, and you give me quick answers? I feel this conversation has been very fruitful because we're not only addressing questions of misinformation about Taiwan and propaganda from China and how dangerous all of that is, how incredibly high stakes, but I think we've given people an understanding in their everyday lives of how to counter disinformation in a regular conversation, which around this topic, again, is also high stakes and important.
Let's do it.
Here's a question for you.
Uh,
Um, Taiwan is cited as a global leader in countering disinformation, and I'm curious about the role of humor and civic tech and education in that.
yeah, this is a great question. So I think a lot of we say, education that we do is not coming from the state, right? But from civil society. There is a reason because, as both of you said, Taiwan has been through the longest period of martial law in the world, right? 37 years under heavy controls of the KMT. So the kind of patriotic educations and propagandas of loving your country, I think no longer works for Taiwanese people, particularly the younger Taiwanese generations. So from a civil society, we are trying to create curriculum, right? That very hands-on activity that people can do not only to create a sense of mutual trust with their neighbors, the society in general, but enhance their self-efficacy. So knowing that under different crises that they can be the one to help themselves. So they don't have to wait for the state to come for help.
In Minneapolis recently, a woman was shot in the face by ICE. And so I think we think about civil defense in a whole new way here. And unfortunately, Americans could learn a lot from what you're doing at Kumak Academy, and also just the idea of local kind of citizen journalism and activism and awareness and civil society and community. We need it. We need it here right now.
And community is really like having a sense of community and, like caring about your neighbors and your neighbors caring about you. That's like the bedrock of any society, right? And
Yeah.
China and
Exactly.
Russia understand this, and so there's dividing a society, pitting neighbors against each other who normally wouldn't really want to argue about much, like that's really a major goal of all this disinformation. And
Yeah.
and right now I've only been here for 10 years. I would say Taiwanese society is a bit more fractured than it was 10 years ago. The KMT and DPP, the blue-green divide, but then you also have the TPP, which is claiming not to be blue or green. But if you're saying you're Taiwanese and it's like, well, we're not Taiwanese identifying and we're not Chinese identifying, what are you? I don't know. But the TPP has basically been moving in lockstep with the KMT in the legislative yuan, basically blocking the defense budget, blocking budgets for the executive branch for diplomacy, reducing budgets for all sorts of international outreach programs. And this is something, and they're not saying like we need to do this to help China. They're saying this is wasteful, or the DPP is they're acting like dictators, which is kind of rich because the last time there was an actual dictatorship here, it was under the KMT. It's kind of similar to what's happened with MAGA in the U.S., where people can't talk to their families or friends so much anymore. It's like, I don't want to talk about politics, and when people don't want to talk about politics, that's when things really start to fall apart. And instead of having that dialogue, you just have I bet this person thinks this way, oh, this person probably thinks that way, and so you don't actually get to know them. You build up this characterization of them in your mind, and it's going to be a lot more flat and two-dimensional than like what you would get if you actually like were comfortable speaking with each other.
Yeah. So here is a good next question for both of you guys. I love this question, actually. It flows perfectly from all we've been discussing, is what would proactive approaches to fighting disinformation be that would genuinely change public behavior or media literacy? I mean, I think in a way we've been talking a lot about media literacy, and just earlier today, I was in a discussion again about this Julia Lochteb documentary, My Undesirable Friends, about the journalists who fled Putin's Russia before he invaded Ukraine. And everyone was immediately only able to think about the US in an American audience because things are so bad here right now in information. Like, we're flooded with disinformation, with Fox News, with Trump's lies, and media literacy has disappeared. And what happens when media literacy disappears, it feels, is that people are either not engaged to vote and deal with democracy, or they defer to the highest authority. They defer to the president. There's just this innate sense of the supremacy of a presidential figure or a strongman like Xi Jinping, or they must know what they're doing. They must be right. They wouldn't be in that position without it. How do we improve media literacy, help change public behavior so that people don't get duped by disinformation? I think we've been speaking to this, but if there's anything more you guys feel.
Chris?
Well, that's a very
Yeah.
difficult question. We're living in an era where like actual fake news is now really becoming a problem. Like where, you've got AI that can generate video that is very convincing, especially to, to kids or older people, who might not be able to, distinguish, AI video from actual video. And that's it's only going to get better and more realistic going forward. But yeah, I mean, we've got like this huge problem coming towards us, and it's some place that humans have never been. We're entering uncharted territory. So I wish I had a good answer for you, but I don't. I don't know
That's a good point.
how we're going to be
It's
able to combat this.
yeah.
I
When do
mean,
you have?
yeah, I don't have a great answer either, but I do think, for at least for my education, we have been taught on criticism and suspicion, right? So a very kind of paranoid,
Yeah.
for critical theory, right? That's kind of where our affect is. But I think in this age, suspicion and, criticism for all action actually lead to political apathy. And that's what I've witnessed. And also where, what disinformation wants us to do, right? It wants
Yeah.
us to feel like nothing's true anymore. So nothing's real. Human rights is bullshit. Democracy
Right.
doesn't function better than authoritarianism. And I do think that's a very dangerous discourse, not just for regular people, but actually for well-read progressive people as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
I'm learning as well, right? In this age,
Yeah.
I do think there's certain values we need to preserve. And I do think democracy is something that I want to preserve, even though we know there's many flaws under democracy, but I still need to believe that it's a better system than authoritarianism. So I think it comes down to that. You need to have
Right.
a set core values that you fight for.
Yes. There's another great documentary, by the way, if you haven't seen The Edge of Democracy and Now Apocalypse in the Tropics, about Brazil.
I think there's also an element of memory, and you look at young voters and they've had it pretty good compared to the older generations. They've only grown up during living in a democratic, peaceful, and free Taiwan, whereas their parents or grandparents most definitely did not. And I think even in the U.S., when did we become a democracy? I would say it was only after Black Americans were allowed to vote. I mean, we're actually I would say we're a young democracy, and we
Yeah.
have our own growing pains that we're experiencing right now. But in terms of martial law or something like that, or authoritarianism, while the U.S. was definitely less free in previous decades, there were moments where I would say the 70s, you had Black Americans and other non-white Americans. They were kind of ascendant, and the U.S. was becoming a much more multicultural and accepting place. And the conservative movement of the 80s, I think, was very much a lot of it was a response to that, and kind of trying to put the genie back in the bottle. And that's what I would say MAGA is doing right now. It's trying to when was America great? It was when everyone knew their place. And that wasn't that long ago. It's living memory, and there's a lot
Right.
of people in Taiwan
Point.
that want to make Taiwan the Republic of China again, and they would like to go back to the KMT. There are many people in the KMT that would love to get rid of Taiwanese focused education for in schools. They would love to repeal the same-sex marriage legalization. There's a lot of things that they want to roll back. And you look at their agenda after a bunch of legislators a couple of years ago went to Beijing. They came back and they wanted to get rid of indigenous television, Hakka television, anything that kind of created this sense of like Taiwan is like a diverse, multicultural society, which is what it is.
Yeah.
And in favor of this kind of like we're all basically Chinese kind of idea.
Right.
It's the thing is, this battle, the information war, it's never going to end,
No.
and so it's just really a big part of it is like who's going to fight the hardest, and
Mhm.
Yeah.
certain forces in different countries have been fighting harder than others in the past few years and few decades. And, I would say, especially since the end of the Cold War, I think a lot of people were kind of like, "Oh, okay, cool. Well, that's it. Our work's done." And it's never done. It's never done
No.
because as soon as you let your guard down, there's always going to be someone pushing
Yeah.
lies, pushing division,
Mhm.
or
Right.
working for, hostile foreign powers. And so
Right.
it's something while you're alive, the fight never ends.
That is a great closing remark. I think we should each try to give one kind of closing remark that you feel wraps up a sense of, how we can fight disinformation and disinformation warfare. I think, Chris, what you've just said is really, really valuable. What I would say is everyone who cares about Taiwan should read both of your books. I mean, that is something. Do that every day. Read and reread if you need to, because there's a lot of information that's very important in both books to absorb. And then I would say it's an everyday practice. It's what you're saying. That fight never ends. So we who care about democracy being strengthened and promoted and facts and truth remaining need to focus on that every day in something that we're doing.
Yeah,
That's
you got to show up,
Mhm.
yeah,
and
you got to show up.
the
Yeah,
people who are pushing disinformation and all that, they're showing up. They are
right,
very much here. If
right.
if if we decide that we're not going to push back, we're just ceding that ground to them, and
Yeah,
we can't really
yeah,
afford to do that.
right. And my contribution was the movie Invisible Nation, which I'm
Okay.
still promoting and working on, and
Mhm.
will be out on PBS in May. And
Oh wow, cool.
yeah, please give us your final, and you'll be the closing closer, the closer of the closing.
Yeah, I do think both your work are really important, particularly I think for American audience who don't know much about Taiwan. And I think particularly for progressive in the US, there's a sense of guilt for US intervention abroad. I mean, I agree. I mean, some types of US intervention is not helpful. But it's not in the case of Taiwan. So Taiwan, again, right, it's an independent, sovereign nation with our own democracy. So we're not asking the U.S. to put a puppet government, right, and then to only be a subcolony of the U.S. We're asking for genuine, for understanding, right, for promoting truth. I do think in this really crazy age of disinformation, if we don't know where to look for truth, then look at how the regular people in the country react. Look at Venezuela, look at the Taiwanese, how they're thinking about the kind of future they want for their country. And I think that's the place that we should stand for.
Thanks
Okay.
for having us on.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
You're so welcome, and I'm so grateful.